Okay.
Oh, Andrea's here. Hi.
I need permission to record, Lynn.
You are a co-host, so you should be able to.
It's asking me for permission.
What about everybody else?
Same here. Yeah, same here, Lynn. I've just sent you a message.
I don't even know how to do that. Aldo, do you know?
I can record. So there must be a difference between my status and everybody else's?
There isn't.
It just says, please ask the host to give you permission to record.
Yeah.
I'm guessing it's in the 3 dots always. It must be there.
Co-host. We're down as a co-host. God, what's Aldo in Portuguese? Aldo, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. For some reason, Sophia's able to record, but Michael and Sophie is asking to ask the host. But they're already co-hosts, so I don't understand.
So you made them co-hosts already?
Yeah. It's working for Sophia, but not Sophie and not Michael.
Yeah, I don't think Sophie and Michael are co-hosts.
Are we only allowed one or something?
Oh, I can do it. Allowed to record local files. Try again now, Sophie.
Let's see, Michael. Allowed to record. Okay, I allowed Michael. Maybe Michael can do it now.
It's working for me now as well.
Great, lovely. I'll start the webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Allow, put on hold, rename. No, I don't have. Okay, oh no, you have permission to record out now, Michael. So
okay, I'm recording now.
Okay, fine.
Let's start the webinar. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I check that my headphones are working okay?
I can hear you, Dan.
Yes, I can hear everyone.
Could we have the slides?
Oh, Andrea, maybe you want to switch off your video for the beginning.
Welcome everyone to our first session in the Worldviews, Latin American Art and the Decolonial Turn. Just before we start, a few notes. We are translating this. We have interpreters who will be translating this live. So there's just a few notes that you might want to take note of. Your mics and cameras are automatically muted for this webinar. Accept live transcript if you so require, and the translations or live interpretations are available in Portuguese, Spanish, and English. So if you press the interpretation, it's like a globe sign, and select your language as required. Otherwise, you can just leave it if you don't need a simultaneous translation. Post questions and comments in the Q&A box whenever you like, and we'll deal with those towards the end of the presentation tonight. And this event is being recorded in all languages. So thank you very much for your attention. Okay, welcome all to this first panel in the Meeting Margins panel for this conference on worldviews, art, Latin American art, and the decolonial turn. I would like to start with a few notes about how the idea for this conference started, and then pass on the words to Dr. Sofia Gotti to speak a little bit more about the whole structure of the conference and introduce the speakers tonight. So when Sofia Gotti approached me with the idea of organizing a conference, looking back at 10 years since the Meeting Margins research project, I felt at once intrigued and a little unsure. Meeting Margins was, after all, a research project run by two departments, Department of Art History at the University of Essex and the Research Center for Transnational Arts, Identity and Nation at UAL. And it was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Yet at its core, it was really a small gathering of 4 scholars at different stages in their careers, each with quite distinct approaches to the study of Latin American art. If I'm not mistaken, at the time, the only one amongst us using the term decolonial was Maria Inigo Clavo, who will be speaking here tonight. Over the course of 3 years, the projects involved, Meeting Margins involved a much wider range of collaborators whose collective contributions marked very much its significance. Some of these have kindly agreed to participate in Worldviews, including Andrea Junta. Professor Junta had founded the Center for Latin American Visual Studies, CLAVIS, at the University of Texas. And through the mediation of Isabel Whiteleg, who will be chairing here tonight in the session, Andrea and her team collaborated with the Meeting Margins team in organizing the first forum of emerging scholars, bringing more than 100 researchers from Europe, the US, and Latin America to present papers across several thematic panels in Austin in the autumn of 2009. Looking back at that conference, provided a sense of direction within which the field was taking. Many of those young participants have now become key figures within the discipline, and we're lucky enough to have today Daniel Killis, Dr. Daniel Killis, who is in this panel, and Miguel Lopez, who will join the political bodies session chaired by Cecilia Fajardo on the 18th of November. These are just 2 examples. Worldviews has no pretension of achieving the broad-ranging survey that that conference, in collaboration with the University of Texas, covered at the time in 2009. But more modestly, we hope that current developments within the study of art in Latin America may be perceived and debated during this month of November. If in 2009, it was already evident that the category Latin American art was problematic for its implied homogeneity, today the intersectionality of many approaches questions not only that continental denomination, but also the colonialist construction of many national discourses. While decolonial theory seemed to be then an emerging approach to the study, today the term is so widely used that it risks losing its critical potential. So in a sense, we're trying to kind of hold on to that with worldviews. If the question of representation still remains, it has become applied not only with respect or in contrast to the Western canon, but to respective national and regional contexts as well, bringing a sharper focus to the problem of agency or its lack among multiple marginalized groups. Speaking from a personal position, it seems that this opportunity to remember meeting margins is both a celebration of the project's achievements as much a reflection on our own personal shortcomings. So without further ado, I would like to invite my colleague with whom I've been working with in organizing this conference, Dr. Sofia Gotti, to continue the introduction and speak more generally about the project and the conference and the sessions, etc., which will be coming along every Thursday during this month of November. Sofia.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for your introduction and also for agreeing to participate, to do this project together. And picking up from what you've been saying, I wanted to start with a few methodological notes that I think the experimental format of this conference deserves. So the task of organizing a conference that would tackle decoloniality really seemed only possible with the help of a team of thinkers who could help us weave a network of connections with artists, scholars, and curators internationally. So this is how Michael and I came up with a wish list of 6 names, which have become our 6 chairs, to help us decenter our perspective around 6 of the macro themes that now organize the conference, and which, as you will see, inevitably overlap and intersect. So during our multiple discussions on Zoom, which happened all over the world at all hours of the day and night, and in preparation for the call for papers that we disseminated this summer, we became sensitive to the imperative to destabilize the academic conference format that we were used to, and to make the most of this digital medium that has been in many ways imposed onto us by the pandemic. So we reminded ourselves of the possibility of experiencing art, even digitally. And we are really grateful today that many artists have contributed their work and words to this conference. And among them, and they are Venuca Evnan, Dora Longo Baria, Danitza Luna, Guadalupe Marvilla, Bernardo Oyarsun, Ventura Profana, Tabita Rezaire, Cecilia Vicuña, Brenda Vega, and Kira Sonorica, that I'm very proud to name. So considering the possibilities of a digital conference, we also opted to offer live sessions each Thursday through November, but also to allow people to engage in their own time with all the pre-recorded contributions that we were able to collect. And all of these will be available on our website 1 week prior to each panel. And we hope that this will allow space for ideas to emerge in the interstices of each section, of each session. So methodology aside, the intentionally problematic title of this conference that we must address brings into relation 2 terms, so worldviews and decoloniality, which trigger the kind of questioning we hope to activate during our meetings. Worldviews is a term that appears time and again to reference those ontological positions, which in turn invoke modes of imagining the world and world making. And this world making occurs through ancestral knowledges or holistic means of perceiving humanity's interconnectedness. So worldviews, as we intend them, contain those metaphysical, semiotic, or vital links that determine our perception of and participation in the world. So in turn, the term decoloniality, as Michael foregrounded, suggests the undoing of legacies of the tragic encounter of distinct and unequal worldviews, which has resulted in the imposition of violent and extractivist practices and habits that very much subtend and govern the capitalist, neoliberal, and globalized, homogenized world in which we live in. So the first invocation of the use of the term worldviews is related to indigenous ecologies of knowledges, which is an expression used by our first keynote speaker next week, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, to consider the breadth of counter-hegemonic globalizations across the South. So in the first session next Thursday, which is chaired by Pablo José Ramirez, titled The Poetics of Abya Yala Towards a Non-Colonial History of Contemporary Art, we will be examining colonial history's extractivist habits and contemporary art's capability of, as Pablo beautifully put it, interrupting neoliberalist desire. So when we speak of the representation of those marginalized, we imply an institutional practice that has been constructed upon a universalizing discourse that is defined by its emissions. So upon such discourses, a canon, of course, is formed, which despite the reconfigurations through which art and culture become understood, often insists in resurfacing. The panel devoted to institutions, which is chaired by Catherine de Zeger and with a keynote by Pablo Miada, is in direct conversation with the panel dedicated to decolonizing the canon, in turn chaired by Ana Magalhães with a keynote by Rafael Cardoso. The two entangled sessions will tackle canons and institutions as political formations. Our inquiry into worldviews will consider how the political inhabits our own bodies, their relation to other bodies, and the transformations bodies incur when experiencing forms of marginalization and oppression. The panel chaired by Cecilia Fajardo Hill, whom I would also like to acknowledge as a vital source of inspiration for the formation of my feminist and decolonial subjectivity. This panel will give us the opportunity to experience forms of embodied knowledge through the work of multiple artists and through the voices of its outstanding contributors, including the keynote, Lilia Moritz-Schwarz. The concluding panel of the conference will dwell on the following pressing question. How can we interpret, exhibit, write about world-making practices defined by insurgency, as well as by their antagonism towards the global racializing capitalism, without diminishing their antagonistic potential? In Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui's words, how do we resist the formation of a jargon, a conceptual apparatus, and forms of reference and counter-reference that have isolated academic treatises from any obligation to or dialogue with insurgent social forces? So in this final panel, chaired by Keina Eleison, we will seek to challenge such systems of reference, beginning with the work of our final keynote, the artist and missionary pastor, Ventura Profana. It is clear that all the approaches to the questions of decoloniality and world-making, which inform the panels of this conference, are not exclusive, but on the contrary, are always interrelated. So it is in such interrelation and hopefully within the antagonisms that will emerge that we can find the decolonial. So finally, I would like to thank all of our inspiring speakers whom we didn't mention in this short introduction, that we will have the opportunity to further introduce each week. And in order of appearance, they are Lena Goyer, Christian Vargas Pillaeke, Carolina Castro, Pamela Desjardins, Clara Masnata, Eloisa Rodriguez, Sebastián Eduardo Dávila, Gabriela Germana, Miguel E. López, Guilherme Marcondes, Jens Baumgarten, Alessandra Caputo Jaffe, Catalina Imsicos, Fernanda Pitta, Liliana Clavico, Felipe Hernandez, and special thanks also to the speakers, Aneli Marisa Aliaga and Eloisa Rodriguez, who helped us in the final presentation preparations leading up to this day. And of course, a huge thank you to the funding bodies which made this conference possible. First, the Leverhulme Trust, which supports my Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship at the History of Art Department at the University of Cambridge, which further supported this initiative with our Center for Visual Culture. And of course, the University of the Arts seed funding and the Research Center for Transnational Art Identity Nation at UAL that offered vital support. Special thanks to the wonderful Lynn Finn and Sophie Pant, who have worked in tandem with Aldo Vidor in charge of all simultaneous translation and the conference's video content. And finally, Octavian Belinzan for the web design. So before finally opening this roundtable on meeting margins, a few final housekeeping rules. So the discussion will last for roughly 1 hour. after which questions will be welcomed. Please feel free at any point during the conversation to put your questions in the chat box so we can present them to speakers. And at last, I have the pleasure to summarily introduce our speakers tonight. The session's chair is Isabel Whiteleg, an art historian, curator, and director of postgraduate research at the School of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester. She is joined in conversation by my co-convener, Michael Asbury, Deputy Director of the Transnational Art, Identity and Nation Research Center, and reader in the History of Art and Theory at Chelsea College of Arts, UAL. Also, we welcome Andrea Giunta, professor at the Universidad de Buenos Aires, where she got her PhD and is principal researcher of CONICET, Argentina, and has, of course, authored a multitude of texts on Latin American international art. Then Maria Íñigo Clavo, a researcher, curator, assistant professor at the Open University of Catalonia, and an MA lecturer in curating art and public programs at the Whitechapel Gallery in London. And finally, Daniel Quiles, associate professor and chair of art history, theory, and criticism at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. I am really excited about the forthcoming conversation. So thank you so much. I will stop my video and hand over to Isabel. Thank you.
Hi. I must begin with some thanks. I really want to thank Maria, Andrea, and Daniel for making time to be here today. I think that Michael and I are on the same page in terms of our recollections of meeting margins and our response when Sophia first suggested meeting margins as a kind of precedent for the Worldviews gathering. And like Michael, the thing that came most to mind was the forum that took place at Austin. In many ways, this was perhaps the most important legacy of the project, and I don't mean that in a grandiose way, but more because it brought together a very wide community of scholars, and they were joined by a concern with transnational Latin American art, and because of this, it produced many new and enduring collaborations. I don't want to take too much of the time we have for discussion, but I want to set the scene a little bit by talking about the context in which meeting margins emerged. The project focused on the 50s through to the late 1970s, and it set out to address transnational relations between Europe and Latin America and between individual Latin American countries. These relations would include those made by individual artists or critics, as well as events and publications that supported the circulation and reception of art and ideas and the formation of distinct networks or regional identities. Meeting margins was also a development from and an extension of an earlier project called Latin American Art and the UK. And it was thanks to this earlier project that I came to know both Andrea and Daniel and their work. This project was developed way back in 2006 and active between 2007 and 2008. And it was unquestionably a product of my own experience as an English graduate student specializing in Latin American art history and theory at the University of Essex, which was and still remains the only art history department to commit to such a specialism. This project set out to map the presence and critical reception of Latin American art and artists in the UK since the 60s, and to address the particularity of a UK-cited approach to Latin American art. So it was concerned with recovering a deeper memory of UK-Latin American relations, as well as understanding how UK-cited knowledge of Latin American art and art history had been produced and shaped by the work of specific individuals and institutions. In retrospect, the first murmurings of what would become a transnational turn in Latin American art history were evident at this earlier stage. Transnationalism was already represented by TRAIN, established in 2004, a research center I came to know via Michael, At that point, there were less than a handful of UK-based people researching 20th century Brazilian art. So those that did sought each other out, and Essex and Train were two poles for those connected to art from Latin America more broadly. Also, part of the context was that at some point during my postgrad studies at Essex, artists long confined to our Latin American specific courses began to cross over into straight art history and theory programs. And this was evident throughout art history departments in the UK. Tate's Latin American Acquisition Committee was established in 2002, so the work of artists also started to become more physically present here. A gradual shift towards a transnational approach would therefore emerge through the work of both those who were regionally specific in their research and those who were beginning to benefit from geographically expanded curricula. Back in 2007, I co-authored a paper with my co-researcher on the Latin American art in the UK project, the scholar and curator Taina Cargol. Our paper, written for a conference in New York, organized by Daniel, together with Irene Small, compared US and UK fields of knowledge and practice. We argued, Taina and I, at that time, that the event that was most characteristic of a UK-cited approach to Latin American art was Tate's decision to contextualize a new acquisition, Eleoitacicus tropicalia, within a collection display dedicated to the artist's connection to London. This approach, which was not yet named by Tate as transnational, made sense of a Brazilian art being acquired by a UK-cited museum, while also creating an occasion to exhibit some of Tate's earliest Latin American acquisitions, those that were brokered by Signals London Gallery in the 60s, and works which until then had rarely, if ever, been placed on public display. Meeting Margins was conceived in this context as a joint enterprise between Essex, representing the advantages of geographical specialization, and Train, foundational to developing a transnational approach to art and its histories. The reach of the project was significantly amplified by Andrea. Bridging Argentina and the USA, she agreed to join us as an advisor at the precise moment that she was moving from Buenos Aires to take up her chair at Austin. Written in 2008, the proposal for Meeting Margins cited observations of a burgeoning transnational approach to Latin American art history from the work of individual researchers in Europe, the USA, and Latin America to recently launched projects and initiatives such as the Terra Foundation's new call for research addressing artistic encounters between the USA and Latin America. When we eventually put out a call for papers for the Meeting Margins Forum at Austin, the volume of response proved that our hunch was right, a transnational turn was in motion. In the space between writing a grant proposal and beginning a project, our own relationship to the term transnational and its implications perhaps became more critical. A risk, for example, was that we would simply serve to expand and not challenge the territory of Euro-USA art by accommodating only those artists who had been in a position to be transnational in the first place, and that such contact might somehow constitute a claim for ownership. Concentrating on networks formed within Latin America, both inside single countries and across the region, did mitigate that risk to some extent. But on this point, I want to turn back towards the participants in this roundtable, and as Michael did, to give particular credit to Maria Inigo Clavo's role in Meeting Margins. Maria was appointed as a research fellow, and prior to that, her work was already located within the territory addressed by the Worldviews conference. As such, she arrived with an existing engagement with theories of coloniality and decoloniality, expanded our knowledge and our networks, and allowed us to begin by already challenging some of our original intentions. So, on that note, I want to pass to Maria, and Maria, to ask you if you could speak and introduce the research that you were doing for your PhD just prior to joining the Meeting Margins project.
No puedo poner el vídeo, no está bloqueado.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I cannot start my video, but I believe you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Yes, I can also no, I am not able to connect the video also.
Gracias. Vale. Estaba el vídeo bloqueado, pero bueno, quería...
Oh, no, it seems like I can start my video. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I am so happy to be here. I am so happy to have the opportunity as well to speak to you in Spanish. I would like to thank the organization, all of the participants in this panel. I hope that you're going to hear me okay. If anything, you can let me know. Well, you were asking me about my PhD, and it is true. I have been working with this type of research about the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, especially Brazilian art from that time. And I wanted to think about the post-colonial theory. I wanted to think about what was happening in the United States, in Europe. I was trying to study all the theory at the time. I mean, how artists were dealing with that theory and also creating some different paradigms, some different thoughts with a different decolonial perspective.
The idea was to see how important it is to show the concepts as traveling concepts. I mean, it doesn't have to be a concept that is useful for that context. But for example, the intermediate idea that Santiago presents in the 70s, for example, showing how these concepts can be used and are necessary as tools to deactivate what is colonial.
Following on from that, Maria, if I could ask you how the prior research that you did shaped or informed your approach towards the Meeting Margins project when you joined it, and perhaps some of its intentions or preconceptions.
Este año publiqué un texto en Certex.
This year, I published an article in Certex, and I was thinking about this Meeting Margins moment of 2010, 2011, that I think it kind of answers the question that you're asking, which has to do with an overall environment, with an overall ambivalence regarding the post-colonial idea, what I call hegemonic post-colonial theory, which is one that was created in Northern academic centers. They started becoming institutionalized, and let's say it was more legitimized, let's say. And at the same time, within the Latin American concept that was celebrating the 200 years of that was celebrating their anniversary, actually, of independence. And in that context, there was a lot of distrust regarding those theories, because of course, those theories were thinking of post-colonial theories. I mean, there was this whole movement of creating this theory that included the years when it began to be generated, and at the same time, a Latin American context that didn't really absorb completely these theories because this mistrust, and because the interest wasn't talking about the decolonial theory, but really deactivate how coloniality was operating in the day-to-day life, or in political discourses in countries, or in social relationships, but not think of the theory itself. And in this text, I also talk about this moment where there are a lot of projects like Meeting Margins that think about networks and that think about transnationality. And they also had an ambivalent relationship with the idea of what is decolonial. I mean, it was this theory that was kind of floating around, but there was kind of like it was like a love-hate relationship where there was an acceptance rejection at the same time. And in my case, meeting margins was very interesting to start thinking about curatorship and post-colonial or decolonial theory. And it's very interesting for what I did later in Brazil in the years that I lived in Brazil. And this has to do with what you'll probably ask me later. It was an important moment for me to be able to combine a bunch of theories and reflections.
Thank you, Maria. And obviously we're reflecting on a moment that now probably feels quite a long time ago. So can I ask you how you think that from the moment of meeting margins and even prior to that, your PhD research, how do you see the field of Latin American art having changed from the moment when there were the initiatives and networks that you're talking about? What do you see as being characteristic of that field?
Gracias. Pues yo,
Thank you for your question. Well, yes. The theory context in terms of decoloniality has widened and expanded a lot and has become very consolidated, and not in those hegemonic post-colonial theory frameworks. I'm talking outside of that. There are other ways of thinking of decoloniality that already exists for centuries or at least decades in Latin America. So what I think is that some institutions have given priority, especially in Northern Europe, even in Spain and the United States. They've prioritized thinking about identity from the identity theory and post-colonial theory. And I think that's very interesting politically. And it's also very interesting when we think about modernism and Westernism. And as we know, the idea of modernism and coloniality go hand in hand. I mean, there is a continuity from those identification ideas, which could be geographical origin. And well, this makes me think that these are ways, they're colonial ways, actually, but colonial ways of thinking of politics, for example. I mean, for example, some think that political doesn't begin when we talk about post-colonial, but it does when we talk about other ways of doing politics and other ways of understanding politics. And I think that nowadays there are two areas that are more interesting, or that can coexist actually, but that they have a very large capacity to make us rethink, to make scholars rethink. And one is to look at history, and it has to do with the curatorship that I mentioned before, especially in Brazil, because the art history has been created through this curatorship. So it's very interesting to be able to analyze history from that angle. And that is done in a lot of different disciplines. But there's another path, which I think is to try to find or respond, answer the question, how do we understand? How do we present ideas? How do we think? And that includes thinking, how does the West think? And how can we create dialogues with other ways of knowing and other ways of thinking? And to finish, I think that it's urgent, and it is still a pending matter, that methodologies don't prioritize protecting themselves as methodologies in the sense of Western discipline methodologies. That's why it's very important, for example, when those of us who think in Spanish, we have to constantly adapt our academic works and projects to a way that aren't really ours. They aren't Spanish, from how we present an idea, making sentences shorter, also writing in a different way. So that means that we kind of change the way we think and change the way we present our ideas. And I think that in these forums, it's very interesting to think about this, that we can't really gain much from thinking of decoloniality if we're creating a new framework where we can't allow other forms of presenting ideas and thinking so. And this has to do with, for example, how we think in Spanish and how we think in other cultures that are not Western cultures that have other frameworks, let's say, and have other ways of thinking. And I think it's very important that the academic environment not only protects itself as a methodological space, but that it also starts to dialogue with other methodologies and other frameworks.
Thank you, Maria. I think that's a really important point. And I guess it's hard to say how capable the structure of kind of academic knowledge, particularly, but perhaps even museographical knowledge, is of truly adapting to and allowing in, rather than kind of forming frameworks into which other forms of knowledge need to fit. So I think it's a really excellent point, and I'm very.
Y solo añadiría que si no se pueden cambiar las metodologías.
Yes, if we can't change methodologies, we will still be an object of study and not a subject of thinking.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and I'm grateful for you for bringing that point. I think I need to move on to our next participant in the interest of preserving time. Andrea, I want to invite you to, and I know it's a long time ago, we're all in this space of recalling and recollection, but at the moment when we met in Buenos Aires, yes. And talked about the project, I mean, I had been aware that there were researchers working with you who were looking at transnational relationships, for example, but I suppose I'm sort of asking you what the proposition of the project to look at Latin America through a transnational lens, or in terms of relationships, kind of meant to you at the time, or how it resonated with the research that you were doing and that your students were doing in Buenos Aires at that time.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And I was reading today the introduction to the conference in 2009 in Austin, and I was making a review of even narrating the moment in which, describing the moment where we met, that it was at the center in Recoleta. I was creating at that time. Then it was around 2006, 2007. And well, it is a lot that happened since then. Then I want to make clear some important points. In terms of developing an international, transnational perspective about Latin American art, I should say that the first lesson I received was in Mexico City when Rita Eder organized in 1993 a huge conference where she was crossing very relevant scholars and with juniors. I was young at that time, and then from them I was sure that everything that I will organize in the future will be considering this transnational perspective, dissenting very much with nationalistic perspectives. No, then this was the departing point. We were talking, then I was moving from Buenos Aires to Austin, then I was not able to join institutionally at that point, then that's why I was integrating the advisory committee of the project. And then arriving to Austin and having the possibility to work with Roberto Tejada, creating the Center for Latin American Visual Studies and being in touch with you, well, it was like natural to make this first conference. And also to say that it was a good strategy because 59 scholars, young scholars, immersion scholars, Daniel was also an immersion scholar at that time. was the possibility to create our own audience. It's not frequent to have more than 100 people because everybody was coming with someone else to a conference in campus. You know, the experience usually is that there's a small community. Then, well, that was more or less the process. Something that it was said about language, and I want to add something concerning coloniality or the coloniality in connection with the language. Since the first meeting we did, we were making a statement centered on trilingualism. You know, everybody that studies Latin American art needs to speak and to understand basically in English, Portuguese, and Spanish, because the knowledge about Latin American art is not created just in each Latin American country or in Portuguese or Spanish, but also in English. Then that's why this was our position concerning the language, if of course it's better for me to speak in Spanish, but we have also a conception about language. This English I use is far away of a correct English. Then it's a corrupted English. And this corrupted English, it's what makes English to be a tool to be used. And of course, it has colonial marks, but Spanish also has colonial marks, you know, for us. Then, well, I like the fluency, you know, to go between one language and the other, to be able to understand what is created, thought, researched in these three languages, in order to be able to absorb and to be involved in the state of research at the moment. I have a PowerPoint. I don't know if you want to make another question on you, or you want me to share to give an idea about how was this first meeting.
That sounds great, Andrea. Yeah.
Okay. Then I will share this short PowerPoint. Also to see, you know, that all projects are connected in some way, you know. I like these three posters in Spanish, English, and Portuguese. But this was the poster of our first meeting. And you can find the complete document with all the papers in a huge PDF. And it's possible to see, you know, how many topics and how rich it was. I want to show also the logos, no, because it was the University of Texas, of course, the college, the department, the graduate school, but also the University of Essex, of London, meeting margins, Art and Humanities Research Council, and TRAIN. Also institutions from Buenos Aires, no, that they were providing support for paying the tickets for the scholars that were coming from Buenos Aires. Then it was a huge initiative in order to put together several institutions, and even institutions like Arteba that is connected to the market, no? And then these are the graphics that were made by Luis Adrián Vargas that shows how it was the participation in this first forum, no? Then of course, 50% from the University of Texas, and then the second was Buenos Aires University, the third UNAM, the fourth NYU. I want to say again, thank you to Edward Sullivan, because he was supporting us very much, an amazing colleague also, University of Sao Paulo, and after CUNY University, Universidad de Barcelona, University of California, Essex, Yale. Then we have here all these universities that probably were participating just through one candidate. but it's useful. This is another way to show the same numbers. But it's interesting because really it was a strong participation of universities from Latin America, from England, not too much from Europe in general, and from the United States, of course, no? And here, participants per country, and of course the United States was the better represented, no? Because for the students was easier to go to Austin from the States, and they have also support. Then, well, it was a process for learning a lot how to involve institutions on helping economically, no, the organization of the conference. Participants per country, another graphic, per region, United States of America, Latin America, and Europe. It will be interesting to make these graphics now, because I think that the research on Latin America and Europe grow up considerably, and also per state in the United States, no? Then the same visualization. And just for you to show how it was after the posters of another forums we organized in 2010, 2012, and how this project continues in some way with the grant we directed with George Flaherty, current chair or director of the Center for Latin American Visual Studies, with the support of the Getty, no? And this is the image that was together with the publication of a dossier with the papers. Then that to say, you know, that what is my perspective about, and also to mention that in this first forum emerged a new generation of scholars on Latin American art. This was the most important contribution. I was looking at the names of the participants today, and all of them are very well located and continues doing their research. They are positioned in different universities. Well, I didn't include the photos of the parties that we had and how it was a celebration, very nice, no? But yes, I think it's a good genealogy from Mexico to the project we developed together, because it's a connection between everything, no?
And it's really good to see just the facts and statistics, because I have impressions of where everyone was from and the numbers, but it's kind of good to see my impressions of it kind of verified. So my memory still works, which is which is good. I guess that I think it would be good also to just to kind of come back to the present, Andrea, and to ask you, what do you think has changed in terms of your own research since that moment, and perhaps also what you observe amongst your graduate students today in Buenos Aires?
Well, my graduate students really, before I go to Austin, were already working in comparative perspectives. I think that Maria Amalia Garcia, doing her PhD research on a comparative perspective between abstraction in Brazil and in Argentina, or Cristina Rossi with her research on abstraction in Uruguay and Argentina. I think also Isabel Plante, she was not my student directly, but she was participating in several projects I was coordinating with this vision, no? Paris, Buenos Aires. Then I think we were going into comparative perspectives. I am not at this point working with a new generation in Buenos Aires. I am working more in projects like the one I am working now with with Poland in a comparative project, Latin America is countries, as well as I was working with George in this parallel art histories, a project of 3 years supported by Connecting Art Histories program by the Getty. Then I am working more from that perspective, no? But really, I can't say too much about how is the state of research here in Buenos Aires of new scholars now. I can say just that. But I want to add something about the colonial perspectives and how we write art history. For me, it has been very important to be able to elaborate a perspective, a point of view that solve a lot of problems. Instead of going deeper into theory and from there to try to find examples, or I was really departing from art history and making clear some points, no? How reductive is canonic art history. You know, it's based all the history of modern art. It's based basically in some few cities in Europe and one in the United States. I was also questioning the distinction center-periphery, particularly because periphery was a very productive term in Latin America, and it was used at the end of the 80s and in the 90s from a decolonial perspective, no? To give value to the periphery. But we are now 30 years later of this intellectual effort, and what we see is that periphery is not a productive strategy in terms of collectionism, in terms of constructing a view about how is art in the present. Then my present perspective is to say, well, I don't want to talk anymore about centers and peripheries. The notion of periphery is a notion elaborated by the centers to name whatever are not them. And then they talk about peripheries because they identify themselves as centers, and to work with notions like simultaneous avant-gardes, and to analyze again the structure and the definition of avant-garde, converting Peter Bürger perspective into a piece of the past, into a document, something that was elaborated in this way in the 70s when Peter Bürger wrote his book. Then to recover another structures of avant-garde. And this exercise allowed me, you know, to feel liberated. I wrote a book that is called Against the Canon, Contemporary Art in a World Without Centers, and opened for me the possibility to think from art history in some way, but outside of art history with capital letters. Then this is more or less the place where I am now. Of course, to work in an exhibition together with Cecilia Fajardo Gil, like Radical Women, helped me a lot to develop a comparative perspective between countries of Latin America. And then all these things, I think, are going together, making the connections between the past and the present.
Thank you, Andrea. And it was good also you mentioned the Getty Connecting Art Histories program, because this is another kind of program that I think has sort of served to establish a view of art history as connected, and perhaps even to allow to support ideas such as those that you're investigating about the simultaneity that we have to try and conceptualize when we're talking about an art history outside of the canon. And Yeah,
and
sorry.
I am working with Agata Jakubowska, from Warsaw University now, and we are comparing feminisms in this country and Latin America. And really, it's it's like you think, well, how we can compare that? At the beginning has nothing to do, but there are many points that are coming up and slowly, and really these exercises to be thinking about processes in specific context that are sharing some aspects or not allows you to work outside of the centers. We don't need to go to Paris, to London, to in New York for understanding many processes that were conceived in the spirit of innovation, avant-garde, conquering a field of ideas, of feelings, and not in the place of explaining the centers how good they were. No? Then to move the perspective helps you a lot to see from an alternative point of view.
Yeah, I think for me, it's not so long ago. I mean, it's a long time ago, but it's not so long ago that people, and it persists to some point to this day, would speak of art history as if it were a competition where certain people were ahead and certain people were behind. And I think it's taken a lot to kind of get to the point where people don't have a concern about sort of imitation and things like that. They're very outdated concepts, but they're still very present, even if in the kind of maybe beyond specialists, but in terms of how people perceive art that they see in the public realm, in museums and so on. The notion that things occur simultaneously and not because one is following the other, I think was still really persistent when I was, even when I was an MA student in a department where there was a kind of segregation in many ways between canonical art and Latin American art. I think I need to move on, just in the interest of time.
Just a small thing to say that we need to recover the words that artists were using when they were proposing what they were proposing. Then glossariums or glossaries that let out the canonical terms and give light to the words that artists were using is also a productive strategy.
I agree. I'm gonna turn to Daniel now. I'm also going to force you to look back in time. I'm just wondering how your approach to the field of Latin American art began, because I know you didn't kind of come from area studies background, but you encountered Latin American art through existing art historical interests, and how did the sort of conjunction of being where you were with a certain background and having an interest in art, specifically from Argentina at that time, how did it kind of inform how you were thinking in methodological terms about your art historical research way back then?
This is a fascinating conversation. I don't think I've ever engaged in a discussion like this where we're effectively
time traveling,
historicizing our own scholarship. But I appreciate it. I'm really honored, by the way, to be part of this panel. I'm really grateful to Sophia. I'm sure all of you played a role in the overarching theme of this conference and this discussion, which I take as a prompt to be critical and perhaps self-critical in relation to our relatively recent past. But we are considering the way that a scholarly field has certainly grown. I'm very against origin narratives, so I'm not going to suggest that certainly my generation started anything in particular, but there also is no argument that in a setting like the United States, which I'm grounded in that the field has expanded, and we can discuss that in very mercenary terms, that there have been a proliferation of positions. There's been room made at the table, as it were. Kaira Cabañas, I think, has talked very eloquently about the stakes of this, that because, you know, another of the questions, Isabel, that I think you're giving us is, you know, how have things changed? How can we take stock? Well, I now feel very ambivalent about I think the somewhat smug position that some of my colleagues and I had in the 2000s, that we were somehow behind a kind of underdog set of figures in art history who were underappreciated, who needed more attention. That shared sense that we were sort of fighting the good fight underpinned a lot of our work and perspectives. And hopefully we took it then and now as a responsibility. But of course, that also means that we should look at some of the institutional structures that supported us and consider them geographically, geopolitically, because I think, in addition to the very worthy critiques that Maria brings up around ideas and intellectual methods, we also have to consider, you know, how these events happen, where jobs sprout up. One need only look at, for example, Pacific Standard Time, which, in addition to amazing Radical Women exhibition, had some 60 other Latin American or Latinx themed shows, which, when you think about the scale of what some of these institutions can put on and what they can conjure into being, I think inevitably, and this doesn't take away from the scholarly value of these interventions, but we are talking about a kind of reflection of power imbalances that already exist in the hemisphere or across regions. And these are transnational dynamics too, in my opinion. So in retrospect, it's worth thinking about that. If I'm going to show you a few slides, and I did throw a few things together, I can't really think without showing images. I think it's my profession. And here I am reading Maria's third text piece very hastily, but there's some good questions in there that I hope we can address. But since you have demanded that I do this, yeah, here is the title, Warts and All, that Irene and I conceived of in 2008. My entry to the field was extremely awkward. I tried to make a virtue of it. I was initially interested in artist magazines in the US, West Europe field, and some of the dynamics of communication and use or reproduction of structures in the mass media appealed to me in the Buenos Aires context. I never particularly saw an enormous shift in orientation. I was aware that probably some of that material had gotten less attention overall, but to me, it was completely continuous with my interests, which were how artists can critique the mass media, how they can get certain kinds of messages out to a broader public or simply to smaller publics of other artists. By the time of this show, 2008, I think Irene and I were interested in a community. We wanted a group of other scholars to share ideas with. And this was back in the Stone Age of people traveling and having to all get together in the same location. Just as in Austin, and these Austin conferences, I'm not going to be nostalgic about them, but they were so important because there was more than just the presentation of formal academic papers. There were friendships, there were exchanges of ideas that happened informally. They had the feeling of like 24/7 workshops that went on for several days at a time. And you know, it's really important to know they resulted in colleagueships and friendships that have persisted long beyond those conferences. So as contributions to our field, I think it's hard to even estimate their value. this was a tiny little graduate conference, but in a way, I think that's nice. I think certainly if there are younger scholars who are on this webinar, that's how to do it. You just start with your own peers, and then hopefully over time you have something of a shared voice. I think the very framework for this conference, that somehow it seemed important to us at that time to use the language of avant-garde, it dovetails very nicely with what Andrea has been talking about, and probably that I'm very happy to cop to, a certain anxiety that we had about the material that we were working on at that time, and how to contextualize it in relationship to other art histories and scholars that we admired and that we wanted to be in dialogue with. They were not limited to Latin American examples. So I think a bit, as Andrea also gestured, already built into our interests was this habit of comparing. Although I think then and now there is and should be a great deal of discussion about how hierarchies manifest themselves whenever we compare. I want to show an image that meant a lot, certainly to me, I think also to us, to Irene and I, when we were thinking about what a conference can be like. I think we sort of fantasized a little about just that again, what Andrea was talking about, like what was the perspective of artists at that time, and which for us was the 60s and 70s. What terms were they using? How were they thinking about something like transnational exchange or communication? I've always loved this drawing. A work that didn't actually happen, but of course, another big idea to us at that time was that proposals and fragments and unrealized projects nonetheless had value as utterance, and advanced experiments in art, whether or not they were concretized. And so this sort of dream of a satellite channel by which the North America, South America, and Europe would somehow be connected. It's in a way just to instantiate the idea for us, carried that spirit that we were trying to think about. How has the field changed? All I need to do is show you this, right? From Marta Menuhin's Instagram yesterday, that now MoMA, her very critical, in my opinion, transnational projects, like what I understand as a kind of demystification of the work of the Center for Inter-American Relations in 1968 Menu Code. It's now, perhaps with a certain irony, cycled back into MoMA, the original Rockefeller institution, right? But hopefully with that sense of a withering critique from within. But yeah, I mean, some of these figures that we've championed are now, if there's still such a thing as a canon, unfortunately, I would argue there is, because a canon is a manifestation of power. So as long as there's still some power imbalance, I think there will continue to be something like a canon in fields of study and in art history. That's not for me to defend it, but I think, unfortunately, it's still something we have to contend with. And we have to contend with the question, what if, in a sense, the Latin American field is part of the canon now? Those of you who've looked at Arlene Davila's Latinx art book, I've been thinking about this book a lot recently, because I think it really owns almost like a dichotomistic perspective, that now Latinx art is the underdog, Latin American art has become glam or something. And that's not to dismiss the argument. I think it's something we should take very seriously. But yeah, this was a material I presented on way back in 2010, long before we thought Donald Trump would walk the earth, right? And I want to stand, I'm showing slides, but I want to stand up for this perspective that many art historians and critics start from, which is from the work itself, from one figure at a time, one gesture at a time. I was interested in the idea that David Lamelas, in moving to Europe in 1968, became aware of conceptual art at that time, and that his conceptual art was not merely sort of jumping on a bandwagon, but had a kind of critical dimension. I still do believe this about his work and his approach. And I was, I think a number of us wanted to make sure that if we were thinking about transnational exchange, we were also thinking about the very apparatuses, the media devices that would facilitate, in some cases, border crossing or the circulation of information. I later got very intrigued by how certain of these artists, including Lamelas, became repeatedly staged television style interviews in these works, and which for me had this dimension of consolidating some experience of encounter that is a result of what I would call artistic migration. That's part of what we're discussing here, right? That individuals have to leave home, travel the world, end up in other centers of production, centers. I also looked at the artist Jaime Davidovich, who to me was a really interesting figure, very much understood himself as a New York artist, but of course he was from Argentina, and I think he was very much aware of experiments that had taken place in Buenos Aires even when he wasn't there. So what are the kinds of transnational ideas that go into a body of work or an artist's career? I don't think they're ever limited to unidirectional movement. I think artists are omnivorous, take ideas from everywhere. And yeah, I was also interested in his use of interviews. He started essentially his own television network, his own television show. He had an alter ego who would go around interviewing people. Some of them were important figures in the art world, and others were people at every level, right, of the museum apparatus. I'm just going through a few things just so you have some stuff to look at and think about. So yeah, again, where's the field? This was a project I organized a few years back. Andrea was involved, for which I'm very grateful. And this is certainly not my idea. I think among other projects that deserve attention in this conference, and I'm sure they'll come up many times, and Miguel is part of the conference, would be Reconceptualismos del Sur. So in many ways, that group inspired the theme of this conference, which was to say, well, what happens if we Havana biennial it, cut out the North, what kinds of networks then become apparent? And one interesting thing that happens here, I would be curious about others' opinions, but with this event, it just seemed to naturally make sense to not limit ourselves to Latin America or Latinx exchanges. We looked all over the world. Here's a project that's more recent. I think, Isabel, you'd wanted to ask me about this as well. Elise Mazadiego and I, she's at University of Amsterdam. We held this last summer, which, yeah, I think from the get-go, we were exploring ways to think critically about transnationalism and perhaps replace it with other models. I don't know how far we got. We are in the midst of starting some sort of working group on Amsterdam in the 70s, which includes a number of Latin American artists, as well as a kind of international group. One that actually is of interest to both of us is Raúl Marroquín, who's connected to a center that Elise is studying, the In-Out Center, which has a range of performance art, video from that time. I'm personally curious. This is Marroquín's Fluxus style little magazine, Fandangos, although he always changed the name. This was Vandangos. And this is almost like just the network is the point of this magazine. These artists that we're now very familiar with, like Cecilia Vicuña, appear in here, in this case, commenting on the recent coup in Chile, scrambling the letters in the country. This question of global fluxus is very interesting to me. I haven't had as much time to look at it as I would like, but I think there's really something there that a lot of these same artists who are curious about transnational networks in this period have some tenuous connections, weak links to fluxus, and as well as video and television. That Marroquín was and this just is to bring my little chat full circle here, that he also came up with a sort of phantasmatic satellite image of, I guess, utopically clear communication across the Atlantic. Yeah, I guess that was a semi-talk, but it's hard for me to just talk off the cuff.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm impressed by you're very good at reflecting on that moment and very honest, actually, very kind of, you're reflecting critically on what you felt at the moment and at that moment. And I kind of feel like we ought to bring into the discussion after what you've just said about, I'm not sure if you actually called it a transnational approach, but I want to bring that term in at this moment because I don't think any of us have kind of completely defined it. Maybe it's not a term that indicates a particular methodology, a particular theoretical orientation. Maybe it's not a term that all of us would continue to use explicitly, but I was interested in the work you'd done with the School for Cultural Analysis in Amsterdam, and whether from that and from those that spoke in that event, whether there were there were rethinkings or kind of conceptual repositionings of that term. And I mean, there was some kind of, spatial was quite central to it, the notion of kind of territory and deterritorialization. Whether how you feel about that word now as a term, is it one you would identify with? Are there ways in which it could be redefined in a critical way?
Yeah, it's hard for me to speak for a larger group and
Sure.
The conversations we had. What I would say is that often I do try to get methodological models from the work and the artists that I'm looking at. And so again, this notion of global fluxus is intriguing to me in the sense that it's about, I guess, no longer underdogs, but figures who in some cases are very much below the radar. What's the word? Not microscopic, but molecular interventions. Perhaps a methodological approach has to change to address those, although I'm not thrilled about this logic of minor literature that's sometimes employed to talk about artists who were perhaps not as self-promotional or ambitious as others. One thing that intrigues me in the Amsterdam context is the importance of the gay scene that was a draw for people like Michel Cardina and Ulises Carrion. That's I think it's part of why they might have been there, that they were able to lead their private lives in a way that was less restricted. So perhaps methodologically we also need to account for that. Why is it that artists choose a particular place to settle and then begin working?
Yeah, I think as you're saying, kind of trying to find your way through the processes and acts of the artists themselves seems a method. I think I like the original concept of the minor kind of in its original context, but I think it gets used in a way that makes it major, and it gets used in a way that doesn't reflect on the actual methodologies that are using it. So to kind of maybe kind of reflect what Maria was saying, that you can't really deal with the concept of the minor unless you've been in the minor space, unless you've been within the minor literature. It's very hard to, otherwise you're just co-opting it. That's my opinion. But I think in the original formulation, it's a kind of very productive model, but it's, the problem is how we handle these tools and what we do to them often. I have a PhD student who uses it beautifully and uses Guattari beautifully, from whom I've learnt much. But I really should turn to Michael on this point. So we're going to blame you, Michael, for the term transnational. we're going to make you take responsibility for it on behalf of Train. And maybe just to reflect on your own relationship with that term. So which came first? Was it something that emerged through your research, or was it rather because of Train, because of this kind of collectively produced center for transnational research, identity and nation?
Well, I think Train, and I mean, when I started my PhD in the 1990s on Eloy Seeker and Brazilian modernism and contemporary art, neither Train nor UAL existed. So at the time, I was following Jean Fisher's fabulous seminars at the Royal College and Middlesex, and also reading a lot of the kind of back issues of Third Text, which kind of informed my application for my PhD, and in particular the scholarship which I applied, which had been offered by the then London Institute. The London Institute, kind of the forerunner of the University of the Arts, was a higher education organization comprised of several colleges that dated from the mid to late 19th century, including Camberwell, where I was based, and which later became the University of the Arts at the same time as the formation of Train in 2004. So Train was very much related to the London Institute becoming a university as well. And I should mention my supervisors, Professor Oriana Badley and Professor Toshio Watanabe, who were respectively the research directors at Camberwell College of Arts and Chelsea. They had been a kind of forerunners within the formation of a kind of research culture within this kind of conglomeration of art colleges, and were very much interested in a kind of cross-college collaboration. And I should mention perhaps that, which is a kind of it shows how the ground was shifting so quickly at that time, is that when I applied for my studentship, I applied to an offer, studentship offer, that was for PhD candidates interested in looking at modernity and the British Empire. So the fact that they chose someone researching a Brazilian artist from the mid-20th century that had kind of, I mean, it would be very forceful to kind of relate Oito Seeker to the British Empire. I mean, I'm sure you could find some means, but so it just showed how the kind of the whole ground was shifting. And by the time I finished the PhD, the following year, UAL was formed. Oriana and Toshio were at the time working in partnership on another research project with Bauta Mitter at the University of Sussex, called Modernity and Identity in Mexico, India, and Japan. So I think tonight we've been like showing how kind of research projects and conferences, etc., kind of help form the kind of the field in a sense. But so Train was came out from that interest in modernity and identity, and that kind of remains in the name, transnational art, identity, and nation, to this day. At the time, the term itself, the transnational, I think was chosen. I think it was Toshio who chose it, but I could be wrong. Because it's kind of seemed to provide a kind of non-hierarchical means of discussing cross-cultural relations, like conditions of transculturation, to use a Fernando Ortiz term that was current at the time. And as a transcultural subject myself, I could identify with a kind of a double consciousness or a sense of being or never being at home, always being kind of displaced or in translation. That seemed to apply to the way Brazil was a kind of approach within kind of types of expectations or indeed prejudices when seen from outside, such as kind of narratives emerging in relation to contemporary Brazilian arts that would invoke particular traditions, whether it's anthropophagy or tropicalia, etc., and kind of presented those packages in the institutions that had just begun being interested, as you mentioned, Isabel, like Tate, in acquiring works from beyond the kind of European and North American kind of paradigms. So it was kind of a pivotal moment, I guess, in contemporary arts, one that shifted from being understood as a kind of a consequence of nationalist paradigms or parameters, and we only need to think of the YBAs, the young British artists, for example, that kind of dominated the 1990s, to see how much of a shift took place around the turn of the millennium towards what I still think of a kind of a rather homogenized notion of global art. I think another important influence that I should mention in the formation of Train was Guy Brett's 1990 exhibition, Transcontinental, 9 Latin American artists, which had been a reference for everyone in the UK, I imagine. Guy had become one of the early kind of visiting fellows at Train, and his contribution was invaluable. And the idea of Transcontinental came kind of from a frustration that he had, having worked, not a frustration with Dawn Ades, the curator of the exhibition herself, but with this kind of overly historical approach towards the field of Latin American art, which kind of, in his opinion, came across very much in Dawn's exhibition, Art in Latin America, at the Hayward in 1989. So I guess a productive relation between art history and contemporary art has, I would argue, been one of the grounding approaches within Train's foundation. I'm just a bit concerned with time, but
yeah.
So I'll stop here.
No, but I thank you, Michael, for just kind of giving some of the context out of which Train emerged, because I think that's important. And you mentioning Guy and Transcontinental and so on, I think for me, Train was more like a place, and it was some people. And the term, some very important people who you could always rely on to gather and to be interested. And I think the term transnational, I think we spent some time like trying to unpack it and decide what our theoretical references were. But it was more that it was embodied through a group of people, I think. And we did have some shared references and we had some different references, but it was, I don't know to what extent it was also kind of a rejection of the national and nationalism. I mean, maybe it's kind of gained that now at a moment in history where nationalism is kind of rearing its head here and
everywhere.
And that maybe, I mean, I feel like my relationship with the term, you know, it was partly to do with recognizing the nation, you know, recognizing, you know, what it is as a administrative thing, you know, that our nationality is largely an administrative matter. Our relationship to the kind of land is something else, and just sort of being able to somehow circumvent it. And I think that was probably something quite shared amongst the group. But as you said about meeting margins as well, we were different people, we had different interests, but we had to have a kind of common reason. We've reached 7 o'clock, and I don't know, Sophia, if we were hoping to give some time for those listening to ask some questions.
Well, yeah, sorry for intruding into the
No, it was
roundtable.
well-timed intrusion.
Just quick to say, this was an absolutely amazing discussion and conversation and presentations. Thank you all so much. And also, there has been this really experimental, wonderful thing happening in the chat, which is people have been talking, which is really great. However, there is one question, actually 2 questions that are still needing an answer. And if you don't mind sticking around a few minutes longer, maybe I can read them out.
Great.
That's great. So one is for Andrea, and it says, if I am understanding correctly, you are talking about the bringing in the glossaries of artists. Is that correct? If yes, I think that artists' intellectuality comes out often through their hands and are pressured to speak like academics and leave out feelings or glossaries that do not correspond to scholarly work. Oh, unmute. Andrea, we can't hear you.
Can you copy the question in the chat? Because
yes.
I don't understand. It's a bit complex.
Well, basically, it's when you're talking about glossaries. Does that not come?
Glossaries.
Glossaries.
Okay. Yes.
Does not that come at the risk of forgetting about feelings and bodies, and to end up becoming academic?
Because, no, not at all. Because, and I have an example. I think it's online. When with Agustín Pérez Rubio, we co-curated Verbo America, the Museum of Latin American Art. We didn't include in the glossary any word connected with the Euro-American, North American styles. We didn't use surrealism, we didn't use cubism, we didn't use conceptualism. But we use many other words that are very much connected with Latin American art, like activism. And this is not a style. Then, of course, words connected with affects, with bodies, could be part of the glossary. It's a wonderful exercise because it gives you a lot of freedom, but at the same time, you have to be able to visualize clearly if the term is relevant or not. No, for example, for Argentinian art, Peronism is part of this glossary because it has an impact in art all the time. Then the terms could come from politics, could come from affects, could come from bodies. You have, it's like a sensitive exercise, no? To have like a radar for being able to capture, and it's anything is fixed with these glossaries. You can amplify it, you can modify it. It's like a way to navigate into words that are not usually in the canonical art histories.
Well, there is a kind of question that follows on to that. So actually the previous question was by Dionia Watt, just in case you wanted to know. And the second one asks more about simultaneous avant-garde and when that started. And also I feel like these are questions that everyone could say something about, to be honest, like the use of terms and things like that. Okay.
Well, it is difficult to explain how I build this model of simultaneous avant-garde because it's not just a word. And Danny was present when I presented once this analysis or model or proposal in Paris, and I was very much attacked because I was using this concept for analyzing or approaching from Latin America to the world of Nashr and Mohammadi. It happened always when you are outside of primary sources and specific contexts, and you want to try to figure out how you can think from an alternative point of view. All models has to confront a specific research. Then it was very much discussed, but even so, I think that is a useful exercise. I think that the concept of simultaneous avant-garde works very well for art after World War II. And I can construct the model. it's useful for Latin America, and it's useful as a tool for thinking in what it was happening, no? That the idea of avant-garde was present in Japan, in different cities of Latin America. Well, I can't talk anymore. That's the idea.
There were just two hands raised earlier, one by Liliana Clavijo and the other one by Rosie Potter. If in case they wanted to, they can also speak. There is also the speech function, but maybe they're not. Maybe their questions have been answered over the course of the discussion. Also for those of you who responded to the questions in the chat, do you have any comments that you would like to share about them? Okay, well, in that case, I'm very also glad that these chats are also going to be saved, so we get a record of this nascent debate that I wish could have gone on more. But once again, thank you everyone so much for being here today, for making me in particular relive this moment that I wasn't able to live. And it was wonderful. And I'm also really happy because literally everything you talked about today, we talked about in class. So everything is still alive somehow. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
It was great to see Michael, Danny, Isabel, Maria. Then it's like, well, mental trip.
Thanks. It's great to talk even if briefly with everyone.
Yeah, it's great to have this reason to see your faces.
Yeah, we don't have bodies, but faces.
Yeah, I don't actually. This is just me. I'm only shoulders up.
Still online?
Yeah, I think we are.
Okay.
But yeah, we can. I mean, we just need to end, don't we, or leave?
Yes. Yeah. And thanks everyone who attended this. I think there were over 100 people.
Yes.
And I hope you can join us next Thursday, same time. Oh, the hours are wrong here, so please ignore this slide.
We wish we could keep you here till 8 p.m. Like, that would be amazing.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All of you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.